Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Stories That Inspire Us podcast. I am so excited to be here on this Friday, August 5th, 2022. And just to let our viewers and listeners know, I am also broadcasting through the Wisdom audio app. So I want to welcome everyone today. Especially, I want to welcome to the Stories podcast, Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Now, I know that everybody has dealt with grief, and today's discussion, let me back up just a moment. You are an advanced grief recovery specialist and an award-winning memoir and self-help book called 16 Days. Wow, congratulations on that. That is so amazing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, the discussion of grief, how did that come about for you? I know everybody, of course, has experienced grief. That's one of life's things that, unfortunately, at times that we do have to go through. What led you to this specialty?
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right. I think most people have got a grief story. We all have experiences of loss. Perhaps the main thing people think about is loss through bereavement, but actually there are many different types of loss that can cause us to experience grief. And one of the experiences that I had relatively recently, a couple of years ago, my young niece died very suddenly and unexpectedly after a very short illness. And I really didn't know what to do. And actually, many of the people around me, I found out quite quickly as well, didn't know what to do and didn't really know what to say. Everybody wanted to help, but it was quite unanimous that people were finding it difficult to know what to say. I think we can be quite fearful. So people sometimes do nothing because at least if I do nothing, then I can't do the wrong thing. So through that experience, having felt pretty helpless myself, I decided to try and find things that might be able to help me. And I read an awful lot of books, but sadly, a lot of the resources I found were quite hopeless. And I needed something that was quite hopeful, because at that time, things are pretty awful and things continue to be pretty challenging. But I was looking for something that may be able to help me process that grief. And particularly with it being the experience that I had with my niece, that I was not her sister, I wasn't her mum, I wasn't her grandma, and yet I was still, someone who was very, very close to her. But I was also trying to support those people who, to my perspective, were also closer to her than I was. So I was in this kind of strange dual position of desperately deep in grief, but also having to try to do my best and wanted to try to do my best to support people who were, to my perception, grieving even more than I was. And that's when I came across the grief recovery method, which is the training that I undertook to become a grief recovery specialist. And I found it just really, really useful. I took myself through the program, which anybody can do. It's a program that has a book that goes with it, and you can go through the exercises. There are a number of different things it asks you to do. It's a very active process. And I just felt that I felt better having done that. And that was all that I could have wanted at that stage, to feel better than I was feeling at the time. And then, having done the process myself, I thought, well, can I perhaps learn to do this to help other people? And that's when I trained to be a specialist, and that's what I do now.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And first and foremost, I just, want to say I'm very, very sorry to hear about your niece. When we go through these things that are so personal in nature, I know that we try to help those around us, but in the same respect, we also need to help ourselves. And that can be very difficult. And it can obviously very emotional to kind of pick ourselves and, okay, let's, I have to make some sense of what had transpired. And in that process, you did like all the things that felt right for you. You became a grief recovery specialist. And in that, as you said, in that active process, you felt better and you wanted to share it with others. And that, for me, is like the nucleus, the beauty of your story, that out of experiencing a very personal tragedy within your own family, and obviously at different times still going through it, but yet you're helping others. And I think that that is just such a beautiful testament and in honor of your niece.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I did at first certainly did the kind of keep busy thing and tried to make sure I was doing everything because that was a distraction from what was going on. But I quickly realized that I needed to actually find some tools to help me with this. And that is what the method did for me. And as you say, the fact that I had the opportunity to do that for myself and experience it myself just made me want to share it, because I thought, you know, if other people, and grief is such a personal thing, so maybe it's not perfect for everybody, but if this can help me, well, perhaps it could help other people. And actually in that act of helping other people, it helps me still share my story, because I think one thing that grievers can have in common is they need to keep telling you about what's happened. They need to keep explaining it to try and help you comprehend what's happened, particularly if it's been a traumatic bereavement or if it's been something that was unexpected, as in my case. Just felt really, really important that I needed to kind of keep telling that story to try and help me understand what had happened. And I'm finding that that is what's helping, because as part of the role as a specialist, you are sharing your story. And obviously the client gets most of the airtime and gets most of the time to speak, but you do get a chance to share your experiences because that also helps them. So I'm finding that really, really useful. And actually, the more I talk about it, sometimes it's a bit more bearable, and some days it can just be a bit more bearable than it was. And that in turn continues to help me.
Right. And I think with the bereavement or the grief process, grief can also be a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
As I've shared with you, my son obviously had a life-threatening injury last year. And I found that through that process, it wasn't just that my son went through this, is I realized I was going through it. And it's taken me a while to, and just a little over a year ago, but I still deal with it really on a daily basis. I'm not going to lie, but part of the process or grief recovery for me is a creative outlet, which was how Stories That Inspire Us podcast came about. But, you know, that just goes to show you, people relate to the stories. They want that relationship to know that whomever they are working with, unfortunately, has been through the grief and bereavement process themselves.
Yeah.
Which obviously led you to write your book, 16 Days. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. And the book really came first. And I think my main work is academia, and I'm used to writing. I'm used to reading other people's writing. So it was an obvious thing to do when I was looking for, like you said, that kind of creative outlet, or to try and find some way to process this enormous thing that had happened to me. So I started to write and did the usual things of, you know, a bit of journaling and just writing out short excerpts and that kind of thing. And where 16 days came from was that was the number of days between Mary Lou's death and her funeral. And some, what I would say is quite unusual things happened during those 16 days. And I felt like I just wanted to tell those stories. So I started to write, and it wasn't a very organized process at all. Some days I would write lots, and some days I wouldn't write very much. And, you know, it was a little bit sort of however I felt about it. But over a period of time, I managed to get together my recollections of those stories. And I realized as I was writing that there were some potential lessons in there that could help people. As I said at the start, people didn't know what to say. And actually that's the subtitle of it, a sudden death, what to say, because people don't know what to say. And I actually think there are some things which people generally can say which are pretty helpful to most people, or things people can do which are pretty helpful to most people. It's such a personal thing, and obviously that there are no real rules around this, but there are now things that I sort of do instinctively when I hear people are going through tough times, and it does seem to work. So I wanted to share some of those little pearls of wisdom that I'd gleaned from either reading that I'd done or just from my experiences and what's actually worked for me. So the way it's structured is the book, just a number of chapters, and it just tells the tale of things that happened. And then at the end of each chapter, there's just some really concise advice of these are things you can do. And the types of things I touch upon are, these are things that you can do if you're supporting somebody who doesn't want to talk about it. Or these are things that you can do if you are in the experience like I was on that, I describe it as that outer circle of grief, really. And then I've just compiled those at the end of the book, which if you want to just flick back at any point and remember those, it's easy to find where all of those pieces of advice are. So it is a memoir, I suppose a little bit of a self-help book as well. And I've had feedback from people who tell me that it's been useful to give it to somebody who's grieving. It's also been useful to give it to somebody who is supporting someone who's grieving. And then other people have read it and just said, I feel like I now am a little bit better equipped to deal with something when it should happen. And I've done some of the things that some of your funny characters in the book have done. And I won't do that again. Or I've done some of those things and actually, yes, it worked, and I'll do it again. So just hopefully full of some concrete, helpful bits of advice that people can take on board and refer back to at the time. And that's probably the nicest thing, because I think many people's worries about losing people is that they'll be forgotten and they won't be remembered. And to have something there that people say they will refer back to and they've remembered about, and time's getting on now, it's been 6 months since the book was released, so I am now having people saying, oh, I picked it back off the shelf because this happened, or I remembered there was something in it and I went back and checked that. And that again is just another kind of nice reassurance that she won't be forgotten.
Oh, absolutely. And again, beautiful for her memory. And I would think for your family too, to know that you've created something that really honors your family's journey, that helps others, which is so beautiful. And I would think too, Dr. Crane, that as people are going through these unexpected events in their lives, maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be a death experience, but a very traumatic experience. For instance, when Ryan's accident occurred, like I, didn't find out until 2 a.m. But, I look back at everything that transpired, and I've been very honest and open. I now can look back and see some of the blessings. But one thing that does stand out to me was shortly after I returned home from Philly, and still, my emotions as a mom being very raw. Ryan was transferred to a traumatic brain injury center, and I had a business meeting with someone. And one thing they said to me was, oh, you look very sad today. And I said, well, I'm not going to lie. Yes, I am a little sad. My son, went through, had a life-threatening injury. He's in a TBI center right now, but it was touch and go, and I feel blessed and grateful he's here. He's got a long road of recovery, but it just goes to show you that when people respond to whatever you may be going through, and I was really taken aback by this person's response, which was very, I would say, nonchalant. Well, it didn't happen to you, did it? and I was on Zoom, so he could obviously, and my jaw must have dropped, and I paused for a moment, and I said, you know what, you are absolutely correct, but I am not going to pursue this relationship
Mm.
because I don't see value in it now.
Yeah.
And, thank you so much for your time. And I immediately signed off of that meeting. Now, looking back at that, could I have maybe worded it different? Perhaps so, but
Mhm.
that just, I think, goes to show you that we never really know what somebody else is going through. And when someone shares something very personal and raw, I would say what in his reflection of what he said to me is not wasn't cool with me, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that there are a couple of things in that for me, actually. Within the grief recovery method, we talk about, whilst we do share our stories, we never compare, because to compare is always to minimize. So whether I'm listening to your story and thinking, oh, flipping out, mine was nowhere near as bad as yours, or whether you're listening to my story and you're thinking, oh, actually, that's nothing, it didn't happen to you, did it? And actually to compare, it only really goes one way, and it's really not helpful. And you can never know, because that could have happened to Ryan, and you could have been back at work the next day, because your relationship with Ryan was different to perhaps people might perceive a parental relationship, and therefore everything's okay, or the reaction that you had, or it could have been different again. So I just don't think you can kind of legislate for how someone might react to a given scenario. You've just got to listen and watch for the language they're using and the way they're behaving, and respond in that sort of way. I think when people have bereavements, and the expectation in terms of going back to work immediately, for example, it may be a loss of a very close family member, but if you weren't actually close to that person, then you might be back at work very quickly. It may be a distant relative, but somebody who's had a massive impact upon you. So I don't think we can ever judge other people's relationships in that sort of way. But certainly how someone behaves will just lead you to know, gut feeling, whether you want to continue with that relationship with them. And I think you did the right thing.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that. And of course, I often see this person on the other audio social app, and I remain professional. That's all I can do, because that's kind of my persona. And it's still a work in process, many days for me to still process. And I'm okay with that. I have those, excuse me, those moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, and again, I've been very open about Ryan's journey and my journey, obviously as his mom. It's been a difficult year. My sleep has been totally off, but I'm working through it, and I feel blessed. When I say I am blessed and grateful, I say it with all of my being. And again, I just look at the many blessings that transpired throughout this whole year. And that really has been very significant and very helpful. And you had mentioned journaling, which is something that I do a lot. And I may at some point, of course, I'm always, thinking I love to write, I love to read. So, who knows? But, it is my hope that, that anyone who may be going through a difficult time can maybe pause for just a moment and be in the moment and acknowledge the grief that they may be feeling. And it's okay to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And I think, again, just that total uniqueness as well, that you can't know what somebody's going through and feeling, but just use all your senses to look out for the signs that they're showing or that they're not showing, and ask some open questions. I think one of my kind of go-to things if people are in very early stages of grief, is to kind of ask, how do you feel at this moment, rather than how are you? Because how are you? There's probably only one answer to that. It's dreadful and everything's awful. But actually, at this moment, I'm okay. I'm holding it together. I've managed to get out of bed this morning. I've managed to feed myself. I've managed to look after somebody else. So I try and sort of think about, if I am sort of asking those questions about how people are, it's just trying to sort of pin it down a little bit to how are you at the moment? How are you this morning? How are you this afternoon? How is it for you today? Because some of those questions can open up, rather than someone saying, how are you? Because you think, you don't really want to know how I am as a whole. You want to just ask that kind of general question that we all ask and don't really want the answer. But actually, if you just break that down a little bit and say, how is it for you today? It's not something that I've done, but I know other people have done it, and I think it's a good tip as well around, I know people in sort of very close either friendship relationships or maybe siblings might have a bit of a code for it, how are you today? And it's a number out of 10 or it's a number out of 5, just to give a bit of an idea, rather than having to go into minute detail about how you are. But it's just a really quick temperature take of, actually it's a 1 today and I need you, or today I'm okay. Because I think some people do struggle with the idea that grief, or a perception that grief is linear and you go through stages. And I don't know if I talked to you previously about how the stages of grief have actually been quite debunked. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some fantastic work to help people who'd had a life-limiting diagnosis, and to talk about how they would approach their own death. And from my understanding, from what I've read, it's actually been twisted and bent out of shape to become the stages of grief, with this expectation that people will go through bargaining, acceptance, all those kind of linear process. And grief isn't like that. If you're still here, you don't have anything to bargain. I can't give you that and I get the person back. So I think that's quite challenging for people, because to try and understand that you're not going to go through a phase of, suddenly in 6 months' time, because that's a bit of a time limit, you'll feel better. Some people might feel better in 3 months, some people might feel better in 3 years, some people might never feel better. So to try and help people understand that it's not always an upward trajectory, and then if you do feel worse, you're not going to always feel worse. It's quite helpful to understand that, today I might be a 2, but tomorrow I'm a 5, and that's okay. And don't feel guilty about feeling okay, because that can be a little barrier as well sometimes, that if I feel better, does that mean I'm not honouring the person? If I feel better, does that mean I'm going to forget about them and I'm going to lose all my memories of them? So I do find that quite helpful, to try and get people to consider, it's not a case of a linear process through grief. It's fine that it's messy. It's fine that sometimes you feel better than others. Hold on to those good times when you do feel better, and when you do feel worse, look for some strategies that will help you with that.
And I think that's really important too, to look for those strategies, whether it be reading. Again, we've mentioned journaling, whatever it is for you that works, that can, take you through that process. And I love what you said about, when you're asking someone, instead of how are you doing, or how are you at this moment? How are you doing today? And I think a lot of times too, people maybe ask that out of respect. Maybe they, and I think for the person asking that question, that can be difficult, because they want to help and support, yet are they prepared to get the answer?
Yeah, certainly. And I think naturally, I think I'm a bit of a fixer. So it is actually quite hard when someone comes to you with grief, because you want to help and you want to try and fix, you want to make them feel better. And sometimes you can't. And sometimes the answer is just sitting with them and being there and being present. But trying to resist that temptation to suggest something that may not be appropriate. And, depending on what your relationship is with that person, you can easily get away with that. It's fine. But sometimes people just want someone to be there for them, literally physically be there for them, whether that's hopefully in person or whether that's doing this online or whether that's on the telephone, just know somebody is there, and somebody that they don't have to put on a brave face to. They don't have to be someone they're not feeling they are on that particular day. And that's really quite
Right.
important.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think with doing that, you're accepting, but you're also acknowledging for them, hey, I see you going through, a rough time, and I want you to know that I am here for you. How is it going for you today? Like maybe it's all about, the wording and the actions that support that. And that can be difficult, of course, on both sides. I know, for instance, this last Saturday, on the Stories That Inspire Us podcast, I had my guest on. Her name is Daisy Page, and she is suffering from a terminal illness.
Mhm.
And we had an amazing conversation, and all she wants to do is inspire people. And I was taken aback, but in such a very beautiful way, that she allowed me to be in the moment with her, to share her journey. And that was so important for her. And I'm not going to lie, I did find myself toward the end of it, I became very emotional. And when we did our little post podcast chat, what she said to me just like melted my heart. She said, I want you to know how much I appreciate what you're doing. And I'm so sorry that you're going through, what you've been through with your son. And I just thought to myself, and I started bawling my eyes out. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, here this lovely woman has a terminal illness is saying to me that I inspire her. And I was taken aback by that, but in such a beautiful, beautiful way.
Yeah, that's lovely. And to hear that from somebody else, that's lovely.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Wilson Crane, when someone is going through the different stages of grief, and you had also mentioned, as far as when we go through these stages of grief, it's not that we forget, or not that we want to remember all those good memories. What could be some different suggestions for people who still want to remember and carry that through with them each day? What are some different things that they can do to help them get through that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that can be a big worry, that you're going to forget things. So one of the aspects of the grief recovery method, it encourages you to note down memories, and you do it in a particular way using what we call a kind of relationship graph. And it's just really a timeline of the different interactions that you've either had with this person, or because you can do the grief recovery method with an organization or with a pet. It doesn't have to be a person, but say it's a person, and you want to try and remember those things. Literally noting down a timeline and making it real as well, of perhaps some of the not quite so positive things as well that happened, because relationships are real in that way, and it's highly unlikely that every interaction that you've had with somebody has been positive. But I found it really useful working with a client who was experiencing grief, and they were telling me that all they had was really negative memories, and that was getting in the way of the grief, because they were thinking, I didn't make the most of the time when they were with me. Why did we have that argument? Why did we fall out over that situation? I didn't know we had a limited amount of time left, and that was really becoming a block to them feeling better. So actually being able to chart out, and the way we do it is a horizontal line across the page, and then an up line if it's something positive, and a down line if it's something negative. And the length of the line just sort of signifies the kind of impact of that feeling. So it might be a little line if it was something relatively minor, or a long line if it was something relatively significant. And what that was really helpful for was, this particular client really sticks in my mind, because they said, I just haven't realized there were so many positive things in our relationship. because they were so totally fixated on the bad, dreadful, upsetting instances that had occurred. And they said it's just such a relief to know that there's a bit of balance in there of kind of positive and negative. And I've seen it work the opposite way, because people can tend to enshrine others when they die, and have this sort of notion that nothing bad ever happened. And I'm not saying you need to always constantly replay over the negative things, but actually recognizing some of those times when things didn't go quite so well, but we made up, or this was quite a tough time, but we got through it. It's just another way of remembering that relationship in the totality, rather than having a kind of skewed view of what might have happened, which again, I think can get in the way a little bit of processing that grief, because the person just ends up on a fake pedestal. And they were perfect and they always did everything right, and then you kind of lose the sense of them. You lose what they were really like. So I think that's one way that anybody could be sort of considering how their relationship has panned out with somebody. And you start with the first memory that you have of them, and you end with just a day. What are you feeling about those relationships now? I've just seen it being really powerful with clients, because they've just been able to get that balance and realism about this relationship that they're very sometimes confused about. And grief is often centered around the kind of conflicting feelings that we have. So it's another way to help balance any of that conflict that you might be feeling, because particularly a kind of parental relationship, if you've been fortunate enough to have spent many years, there will have been ups and downs for sure. But if we don't recognize that, our kind of recollection of that can suddenly become very sort of skewed and complicated and confused. So yeah, I would recommend a relationship. I call it a relationship graph, and the method calls it that. And that's something to just kind of chart all the different times, all the different interactions that you may have had, and your feelings surrounding those.
Wow, that is so powerful. And Dr. Wilson Crane, you touched on something that I didn't even think of with the grief process, the negative memories. And that can bring up a whole ball of wax for different reasons.
Yeah.
But I love the exercise and the description that you gave with that about, making that relationship graph, and maybe looking at all those positive things in a different light, as you said, to balance it out.
Mm-hmm.
That is pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. It is. I think it is, and that kind of the negative memories, particularly because there can be so much guilt surrounding that. Because if you've had an interaction with somebody, and maybe you've had a period of estrangement, and then when the person has died, and you think, well, I can never get that time back, but actually, if you can plot that and remember it, but then think about, okay, well, what happened in between? It's a good way of trying to not overlay with your grief all the kind of guilt that sometimes goes with that. Or even if you've had a relationship with someone, and you know that you've been mean and you've been unkind to them, it can then be difficult when they're not around, because you can't actually say sorry to them, and you can't make good of that, particularly if that has happened and the person has died and you haven't had a chance to do this. Again, with the method, you have a chance to complete some of that communication, and that's where the next kind of stage goes. And that's really helpful and powerful, because if the person's no longer around and you can't communicate those feelings, you're left with them here, and that's what's causing you the heartache.
Wow. And I just want to let everybody know and say to our listeners on the Wisdom Audio app, thank you so much for being here with Stories That Inspire Us. Today's chat podcast with Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane. She is the author of 16 Days. And continuing on with the podcast, Dr. Wilson Crane, you said plot and remember, like to complete that timeline Wow. I can think of, I'm sure, a lot of instances, as well as some as our viewers and listeners can probably attest to in their lives, that what if someone doesn't want to complete that? Like if they're in that negative memory and they're just like, nope, that's it, I'm not going to do this.
Well, I think that there's always a choice, isn't there? So if I'm usually working with clients who approach me because they do want to feel better.
Mhm.
So if somebody is stuck but wants to stay stuck, then this is perhaps not the process for them. It would be useful to maybe explore with them, and this is what I would do. You know, what is it that's stopping you from wanting to feel better? Because you expect that most people would take you up on that offer if you say,
Right.
there's something that I think, and it's evidence-based way to make you feel better. So what is stopping you? And you know, some things that may be stopping people, again, can be around, you know, does that mean that if I'm trying to process this and deal with this, is that some kind of slur on the person because I'm now not going to be so all consumed by my grief as I have been. I think, and I've seen this a little bit when people kind of take on the grief and it becomes part of their identity. I don't think that ever really goes away, but there are some people who then feel a little bit scared because whilst what I'm feeling is hard and difficult, it's what I've got used to, it's what people expect of me now. So that can be a reason why sometimes people might be a little bit resistant to the concept of, you know, let's change, let's do things differently. People generally struggle with change anyway, so there could be some just general resistance around, I don't know this magic that you're going to do, I don't know what I'm going to get, so I'm a bit scared of it. So there could be elements of that as well. But mostly people who've approached me or who I've sort of recommended to the method, it's because I know they're open to thinking about things in new ways, and because they're actually, you know, they've come to me because they're stuck and they want a way out of that. So it would be a challenging one if a client who wanted to work with me in that way, but didn't want to approach a particular relationship. But a kind of soft way into that would be maybe to look at a different relationship. And, you know, more often than not, clients come to me to say, it's to do with my father, you know, my dad's died and I can't get over that. And yet the first relationship we complete is not about their father, it's about somebody else. Because you think it's about that, but actually when you break it down, the biggest issue is about something else. And that's really quite common, I think, because grief is thought to be cumulative. So if we haven't dealt with grief from one situation, then we experience another situation and maybe another and another. It may be, you know, it could be as kind of innocuous as the death of a neighbour that you weren't very close to, but it just knocks you off your feet and you don't understand why that's happened. And I would suggest that one reason why you feel so bad as a result of that kind of situation is because you've got stored up the other stuff that you haven't processed. So very often when we get to that completion stage, clients won't be working on that first relationship that they thought they were approaching you with, which again is fascinating. But they go through the phase and then they understand how it makes them feel better, and then we move on to that relationship.
Wow. Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane, how can our viewers and listeners get in further contact with you?
Sure, I'd love to chat more with anybody. As you can tell, I'm really happy to kind of speak candidly about my own experience. And as I said at the start, that does help me. So one of the best ways to reach me is via my website, and it's just simply drvictoriawilsoncrane.co.uk. And in there, there's a page on grief. And I have a Calendly meeting, so people can book a discovery call completely free of charge to have a discussion. More than happy to talk to anybody about what they're experiencing right now. And then people can find the book from the same site as well if you're interested in reading the book. And again, more than happy to talk to people about my experiences through that and how I think it may be helpful to others.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I obviously will make sure that all of your contact information is properly noted in the show notes. I can't thank you enough for being here today, not only sharing your story, but your personal story and being raw and authentic, because those are the type of stories that inspire us. I want to thank you so much for being here. And I do hope that you will come back at some point, because I certainly would love to have you on again.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been really, really nice talking to you. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Everybody, you know, this has been such an amazing podcast with Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane, sharing her advanced grief recovery and sharing her information on her book, 16 Days, and more importantly, sharing her journey as a grief recovery specialist. And, you know, everybody has been through grief. We all have our own stories. And I want to encourage each and every one of you, if you have a story to tell, a story you want to share, and you don't feel that it is worthy, trust me, your story is worthy, because chances are you will inspire someone with your story. My name is Janice, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. Today, I was inspired by Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to all my amazing listeners on the Wisdom Audio app. And we shall see you soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now. Hey, everyone on Facebook. I want to thank you all for being here. My gosh, this was such a powerful podcast. Thank you all. I can't really, Dr. Wilson Crane, such great information for anybody who may be struggling in the grief process. Again, my name is Janice, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. Truly, these are the stories that inspire us. Thank you, Dr. Crane. Bye for now, everyone.